Hey folks, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about using Docker with Elastic Beanstalk. So let's first talk about what Docker is. Now, I had a nice pair of khaki Dockers in the late 90s, but that's not what we're talking about here. Docker is an open source project that provides a layer of abstraction and automation of operating system virtualization on Linux. Now, when you take the AWS DevOps Professional certification, there's a good possibility that you'll see a few questions related to Docker. So, for the purpose of this course, Docker containers provide a tool to package an application and all of its dependencies in a virtual container so that it can be run on any Linux system. So we can configure, manage, package, and deploy images. Now, these images will give us consistency. And if we look at the diagram, we have environment types of multi-container and single container. So we'll talk about both of these in this lesson, and we'll do a walkthrough on single container at the end of the lesson. Now, this certainly won't be a deep dive on Docker, but we're going to cover the basics and certainly give you an idea of what you need to know in preparation for the DevOps Pro certification exam. Linux Academy has some great Docker courses if you do want to take a deeper dive. Now, let's talk a little bit about scenarios, and that's always important at the AWS professional level. So let's say there are multiple developers working on the same application, but they're working on different machines and possibly different operating systems. How can we make sure that there are no compatibility or dependency issues? And these types of things can really eat up time. If you have developers and they're just trying to get their environment set up and they're having difficulty just doing that, it's an excellent opportunity to use Docker, where you can introduce consistency in environment and get your software developers developing quickly. And in this type of scenario, we can create an image of our application in a Docker container and send it to all the developers so that they have an identical environment to work from. Another type of scenario would be where the team is tasked with migrating an existing application running on a custom application server, maybe an on-premises server, to AWS. So this application also has custom dependencies, and there's definitely a concern that it's not going to work properly. Well, you can get rid of all of those question marks. You can package the application and dependencies with Docker and deploy the Docker container with Elastic Beanstalk. So, of course, we're in the Elastic Beanstalk section, and ultimately we're talking about using Docker with Elastic Beanstalk. So Docker can be used with Elastic Beanstalk to maintain consistency across multiple uses. And let's click on Key Concepts for more content. Abstract the application from underlying virtualized hardware. And it helps answer the question, do I have all I need to run my application reliably? So when it comes to running Docker with Elastic Beanstalk, as we saw in the diagram, there are two generic configurations: single container and multi-container. Single container is used to deploy Docker image and source code inside a single container per instance. Now, multi-container, we see where that's going. It's used to deploy multi-containers per instance. Now, here's a key point about multi-container. It uses Amazon ECS, which is EC2 Container Service, to deploy a cluster in the Elastic Beanstalk environment. Now, a good example of this would be to run PHP in one container and Nginx in another container. And remember, multi-container on one instance. Now, with the single container environment, we can deploy our application using a Docker file, and we'll take a look at a Docker file shortly. We could also have a Docker run.aws.json file, or both. The Docker file describes the image to build with instructions. Now, Docker run.aws.json can specify the image to use as well as Elastic Beanstalk configurations. So when you want additional configuration control over Elastic Beanstalk, you can use the Docker run file with Docker file. All right, so what about multi-container? Well, with multi-container, the Docker run.aws.json file is required. Let me just emphasize that. For single container, the Docker file is required, and the Docker run file is optional. Docker run is required with multi-container. Now, another difference is that we can't build custom image with Docker files. Instead, we need to host these images in public or private repositories. So we build a custom image, and then we deploy it to an online repo, and then we create the Elastic Beanstalk environment. All right, now I'm going to switch the split screen, and we're going to look at some of these Docker files. So let's start with the Docker run.aws.json, and this is for multi-container. Now, this Docker run version of 2 indicates it's for multi-container. If this was a 1, it would be for single container. Then we specify the volumes on the EC2 instance with names so that we can map these to our containers. Now remember, we have 2 containers on a single instance, and still using the example of PHP and Nginx. Then we have container definitions, and this is where we set parameters, just like we would in an AWS ECS task definition file. So we're specifying the name of our container, the name of our Docker image that we want to use, and environment variables we want to pass into our container. Then we have the essential parameter set to true, which means the task will stop if the container fails. Then we specify how much memory we want to reserve for the container, and then we're specifying mount points. So inside this file, we have 2 containers. We have 2 container definitions. We went over PHP, and here is the one for Nginx. Now, the only thing different in this portion for the Nginx container is this links parameter. And look, it's linking to the other container, which allows them to communicate securely. Now, in addition to the Docker run file, we have access to configurations in the .eb extensions directory. And we'll talk about that directory and its config files in the next lesson. Now, remember the overall setup here. We have multiple containers. We have 2 containers on one EC2 instance, and we can use EB extensions and specifically config files within the EB extensions to send Elastic Load Balancer traffic to each of these containers based on port number. Example being the PHP container could be on port 80, and the Nginx container could be on port 9000. Okay, now let's conclude this lesson with a walkthrough on a single container deployment. But first, let's check out a Docker file. So this is a Docker file for a single container deployment. So basically, there are a few run commands. It's performing an update first. It's installing Nginx. Key command is expose, and it's exposing port 80. The CMD command, the main purpose is to provide defaults for an executing container. So it's just providing an executable and then 2 parameters. All right, now let's see this in action. Let's go to Elastic Beanstalk. All right, let's create a new environment. And let's choose a pre-configured platform. And we want Docker. Note we could select multi-container Docker. Let's just choose Docker and sample application. So let's click Create Environment. All right. And within a few minutes, we should have a working application. All right. It looks like we have a successful Docker single container deployment. Now this will transition back to the main page, but it looks like our URL should be good. So let's check it out. There we go. Let's browse to our URL. And we've successfully deployed a Docker container, a single container environment to be specific, using Elastic Beanstalk. So with that, we have completed this lesson. Go ahead and mark it complete, and let's move on.